What in God's name is that?
I don't believe my eyes. Run!
I never thought I'd be standing in a frozen field at 2 in the morning, watching something impossible hover 300 feet above my head, until September 5th, 1891 changed everything I believed about what was real in this world. The thing had one massive, flaming red eye that seemed to be staring directly into my soul, and I knew right then that life in Crawfordsville, Indiana, would never be the same again. You see, back in 1891, Crawfordsville was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business. We had our main street with Henderson's General Store, the Methodist church where Reverend Switzer preached every Sunday, and the ice house where Marshall McIntyre and Bill Gray worked harder than mules every single day. The town was quiet, predictable, safe. We'd just gotten those newfangled electric lights installed downtown, and folks were still marveling at being able to walk the streets after dark without carrying lanterns. Life moved at the pace of horse-drawn carriages and church bells, and the most exciting thing that usually happened was when the traveling medicine show came through town twice a year. But that morning, as Marshall and Bill were preparing for their usual ice delivery route, loading up their wagon in the pre-dawn darkness, something made them both stop dead in their tracks. Marshall later told me he felt this strange, creeping sensation crawling up his spine like ice water, even though the morning was warm for September. Bill said it was like someone was watching him from somewhere he couldn't see. They both looked up at exactly the same moment, and what they saw hovering above them defied every law of nature they'd ever known. The creature was enormous, maybe 18 feet long and 8 feet wide, pure white like fresh snow, but it moved through the air like it was swimming through water. Most terrifying of all was that single, burning red eye in the center of what should have been its head. There was no mouth, no nose, nothing human or animal about it, just that horrible, flaming eye that seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. The thing made a sound too, a wheezing, hissing noise that cut through the morning silence like a rusty blade. Marshall swore he could feel the breath of whatever this thing was, even though it was hundreds of feet above them. But that wasn't even the strangest part about what happened that night in Crawfordsville. Earlier that same evening, around midnight, Reverend G.W. Switzer had stepped outside his house behind the Methodist church to draw water from his well. Now, Reverend Switzer wasn't the kind of man given to flights of fancy or tall tales. He was a respected pillar of our community, a man who chose his words carefully and never spoke of things he hadn't seen with his own eyes. But as he stood there in his nightclothes, bucket in hand, he felt something that he later described as the most unnatural sensation he'd ever experienced. He told me the air itself seemed to change, becoming thick and heavy, like the moments before a violent thunderstorm. Even though there wasn't a breath of wind, he suddenly felt compelled to look skyward, as if something was calling to him from above. What he saw made him drop that bucket with a crash that echoed through the silent streets. Floating directly overhead was what he described as looking like a demon wrapped in a shroud, or perhaps a milk-white cloud that moved with purpose and intelligence. The creature writhed through the air in a serpentine motion, twisting and undulating like a massive snake swimming through the sky. It was far too low to be any natural cloud, and it moved much too deliberately to be anything driven by wind. The Reverend stood there transfixed, watching this impossible thing dance above his home, above his church, above everything he'd held sacred and rational in his ordered world. Reverend Switzer wasn't a man to keep such a sighting to himself, especially when it challenged everything he thought he knew about God's creation. He rushed inside and woke his wife, Martha, shaking her gently but urgently. "Martha, you need to see this," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. "There's something in the sky that shouldn't exist." Together, they stood in their backyard, watching this otherworldly visitor perform its aerial dance. Martha later said the creature would occasionally descend lower, sometimes appearing to land in neighboring yards before rising again into the darkness. Unlike Marshall and Bill, who eventually became so frightened they hid in the nearest barn, the Switzers watched for nearly an hour before the sheer strangeness of it all exhausted them. They finally retreated indoors, but neither of them slept for the rest of that night. How could they? How could anyone sleep after witnessing something that challenged the very foundation of reality? When morning came, both sets of witnesses made their way to the offices of the Crawfordsville Journal. The newspaper's editor, probably thinking he was dealing with a couple of pranksters or men who'd been sampling too much corn whiskey, was initially skeptical. But when Reverend Switzer walked through those doors and corroborated the ice delivery men's story, everything changed. This wasn't just any witness. This was a man of God, a respected leader in the community who had never been known to lie or exaggerate. The Journal published their account under the headline, "A Strange Phenomenon," describing the airborne monster in detail that still sends chills down my spine when I read it today. They wrote of a horrible apparition that hovered over the city, gruesome in aspect, moving rapidly through the air by means of several pairs of side fins. They described how it had no definite shape or form, no visible tail or head, just that one great flaming eye that seemed to watch everything below with malevolent intelligence. If you think that's strange, wait until you hear what happened next. Word of the Crawfordsville monster spread through town like wildfire. By that afternoon, everyone was talking about it. The barber was discussing it while cutting hair. The ladies at the church social were whispering about it over their needlework, and the men at Henderson's general store were debating what it could possibly have been. Some folks were terrified, keeping their children indoors and their curtains drawn. Others were fascinated, hungry for more details about this unprecedented visitor to their quiet town. But Crawfordsville's monster wasn't content to remain local news. Within days, newspapers across the country had picked up the story. The Indianapolis Journal ran a detailed account, and even papers as far away as Brooklyn were reporting on Indiana's flying demon. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle published an article titled, "A Substitute for the Sea Serpent," initially expressing skepticism about the ice delivery men's account, but admitting that when a religious man like Reverend Switzer corroborated the story, it demanded serious consideration. The attention was unlike anything our little town had ever experienced. Reporters arrived on the afternoon trains, their notebooks ready and their cameras loaded with film. The local postmaster was overwhelmed with mail from curious folks across the nation, all wanting to know more about our mysterious visitor. Scientists and professors offered their theories, with some dismissing the entire event as mass hysteria or the effects of too much alcohol. Professor Robert Burton stated publicly that it was nothing more than a delusion that had affected the optic nerves of men who had probably been inhibiting intoxicants. But the witnesses stood firm in their accounts. Marshall McIntyre and Bill Gray never wavered from their story, even when faced with ridicule and skepticism. Reverend Switzer, whose reputation was everything to a man in his position, never backed down from what he'd seen. These weren't men given to fantasy or deception. They were hard-working, honest folks who had seen something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. As night fell on September 6th, the day after the initial sightings, hundreds of Crawfordsville residents decided they weren't going to miss their chance to see this creature if it returned. Families gathered in their yards, men positioned themselves on rooftops, and crowds assembled in the streets. All eyes turned skyward. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and fear. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, while grown men checked their pocket watches nervously, wondering if whatever had visited their town would dare return. And around 2 in the morning, according to multiple witnesses, it did. The creature that appeared on the second night matched the descriptions from the first sighting almost perfectly. It had those same strange fins, the same writhing, serpentine motion, and most disturbing of all, that same burning red eye that seemed to look directly at each person below. Some residents claimed they could actually feel the breath of this aerial serpent as it swooped lower, bringing with it an unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the September weather. What I had to discover next was the hardest truth of my investigation into this case. The fact that the creature returned for a second performance convinced many that this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or mass hysteria. Something real, something impossible, had chosen Crawfordsville as its temporary home. The second night sighting was witnessed by even more people, and their accounts were remarkably consistent. This wasn't the confused recollection of a few frightened individuals. This was testimony from dozens of reliable citizens who all described seeing the same impossible thing. But as the days passed and the initial excitement faded, skeptics began offering explanations that seemed to make more rational sense than admitting we'd been visited by some otherworldly creature. The most popular theory, proposed by two local men named John Hornbach and Abe Hernley, who had investigated the second night sighting, was that the monster was actually a flock of birds. They suggested that the recent installation of electric lights in downtown Crawfordsville had confused a large group of killdeer, birds known for their white underbellies that could explain the creature's pale appearance. The birds' wings, they argued, could account for the fins that witnesses described, and their erratic flight pattern around the unfamiliar lights could explain the serpentine motion that had so frightened observers. It was a logical explanation, one that didn't require believing in impossible creatures or supernatural visitors. There was even some evidence to support this theory. The day before the first sighting, the Wichita Eagle had run a small article about boys in Crawfordsville experimenting with balloons, sending cats up into the sky with parachutes. Perhaps, some suggested, the combination of experimental balloons, confused birds, and the psychological effect of recent ghost stories had created the perfect conditions for mass hysteria. Yet even the bird theory couldn't explain everything. Killdeer aren't known to flock together in the massive murmurations that would be necessary to create an 18-foot apparition. The red eye that every witness described wasn't easily explained by any bird behavior. And most puzzling of all, how could a flock of birds remain in essentially the same area for over an hour, performing the same repetitive motions that witnesses described? The weather theory was equally problematic. Some suggested the creature might have been an unusual cloud formation or atmospheric phenomenon, but clouds don't hover at such low altitudes without being fog, and fog doesn't move with the purposeful, intelligent motion that witnesses described. The idea of a tornado was quickly dismissed. Tornadoes move, they cause damage, and by 1891, people in Indiana certainly knew what tornadoes looked like. What I discovered at the end will leave you speechless. After months of investigation, after reading every newspaper account and interviewing every witness I could find, I realized that the Crawfordsville monster case represents something far more significant than just another unexplained sighting. This wasn't a case of a few unreliable witnesses seeing something they couldn't identify. This was an entire community, including respected religious leaders and hard-working citizens, all describing the same impossible thing in remarkable detail. The physical evidence, while limited by the technology of 1891, was consistent. Multiple witnesses from different locations all described the same creature at the same time. The newspaper accounts, written by skeptical journalists, corroborated the basic facts even while offering alternative explanations. Most importantly, the witnesses never changed their stories, even when faced with ridicule and scientific skepticism. What makes this case truly extraordinary is what happened to the witnesses afterward. Marshall McIntyre and Bill Gray continued their ice delivery business, but neighbors said they were never quite the same after that night. They would sometimes stop their work to scan the skies, as if expecting their visitor to return. Reverend Switzer incorporated the experience into his understanding of divine mystery, suggesting in later sermons that God's creation contained wonders beyond human comprehension. The town itself was permanently changed by those 2 September nights. Crawfordsville became known throughout Indiana and beyond as the place where something impossible had been witnessed by dozens of reliable citizens. Even today, more than a century later, the story remains part of the town's folklore, passed down through generations of families who refuse to let the memory die. But here's the evidence that convinced me this was more than just mistaken identity or mass hysteria. In the weeks following the sightings, several witnesses reported finding unusual marks in their yards, circular impressions in the grass that couldn't be explained by any normal animal or weather phenomenon. These marks appeared exactly where some witnesses claimed to have seen the creature descend temporarily to the ground. More compelling still, the Crawfordsville Journal's archives contain letters from residents of neighboring towns reporting similar sightings in the days following the main event. A farmer outside of Lafayette wrote that he'd seen a white, serpentine shape moving across his fields 3 nights after the Crawfordsville incidents. A woman in Frankfort reported waking to see something with a red light hovering over her barn. These weren't copycat sightings or people seeking attention. These were private letters to the newspaper, written by individuals who had no way of knowing about each other's experiences. If this has happened to you, drop "witnessed" in the comments. Anyone who's experienced something similar will understand the profound impact of seeing something that shouldn't exist according to everything we think we know about the world. The Crawfordsville monster case stands as one of the best documented unexplained aerial phenomena of the 19th century, supported by multiple credible witnesses, contemporary newspaper accounts, and physical evidence that defied conventional explanation. Let me know in the comments if you know a place like Crawfordsville where the impossible became reality for an entire community. What happened over those 2 September nights in 1891 reminds us that our understanding of the natural world might be far more limited than we'd like to believe, and that sometimes the most extraordinary events occur in the most ordinary places, witnessed by the most ordinary people who become forever changed by their encounter with the impossible.